Welcome back to the show, everybody. Our guest this evening is a musician. List that first. It's the most important. An author. Would you be offended by being referred to as a political pundit?
No, not at all. I've been called
All
much
right.
worse even today.
All right. And the host of Tom Mullen Talks Freedom, which you can find out more about at his website, tommullentalksfreedom.com. Is it .com?
Yes, sir.
I should look these things up before we start these damn things, you know? Like a real professional host. Tom Mullen, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here.
Tom, you and I were discussing before we get started tonight. You said, "Hey, let's talk about sort of the collapsing narratives and the as you referred to them, COVID criminals trying to wiggle their way out of these narratives, which is really a great move if you can pull it off because they've been building these narratives for what 2.5 years, but suddenly it's no longer politically in vogue to be attached to that sinking ship. And sure enough, wouldn't you know it? Dr. Anthony Fauci, this very week while we're planning this conversation, goes on TV and says, quote, I never recommended lockdowns. Those words came out of this man's mouth on TV, despite the fact that we have, I mean, how many hours of footage of this very man advocating at town halls for that very thing. Tom, what do you think about that?
It's unbelievable. And as you said, he hadn't even made that statement when we first started talking about having this conversation. I was originally referring to Dr. The Scarf Burks. I can't remember her first name. Is it Deborah? Uh,
Deborah.
Deborah Burks, saying that she really always knew that the vaccines weren't going to prevent infection. In other words, that they weren't vaccines. And we kind of overplayed those, I think, in hindsight. And she's trying to wiggle out of, her role in all of this. Of course, everybody, I don't know, these people don't realize there's the internet, right? And that people have saved these things, even if you delete, the web page. So people are showing footage of her contradicting what she's saying now. Same with Fauci. Showing footage of him saying that he recommended to the president that we need to shut down the country. And now he's just trying to say, I never said that. It's like that Eddie Murphy skit from years ago where, he's cheating on his wife and the wife catches him. And he keeps saying, I don't see any girl until the girl leaves. And, somehow we're supposed to fall for this. It's unbelievable.
Now, I've got the quote right here. Deborah Burke said, "I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection. I knew. I think we overplayed the vaccines." She goes on later. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older and vaccinated. That's especially that last part. That's quite the admission, isn't it?
Yeah. And I guess the question on my mind, and I'm a little bit cynical about this, is anyone, and I don't mean the government, I mean the public, will the public hold any of these people accountable? Because the record is not very good on this. We had the Vietnam War, which they told the public throughout the Vietnam War, it's going good, we're about to win, it's going good, got to spend another $10 billion. And of course, we find out later that it was never going well, or at least it wasn't going as well as the public was being told. And of course, at the end, the North Vietnamese took over South Vietnam. So the whole thing was a big waste. If you go back before that, even the New Deal, at the end of that, the cabinet was starting to say, well, we really didn't solve anything. Unemployment's just as bad as it was when we started. We just spent a whole bunch of money. But nobody is even looked askance at historically. No one's saying we can never do another New Deal again. In fact, they want another New Deal, and there's at least some public support for it. So, I'm a little. I was hoping you'd cheer me up, Alan. You're such an upbeat guy. you might convince me this time it's going to be different.
Well, something you've given me so much to talk about already. Something you brought up a second ago is that we have the internet. These people who tell these just bold-faced lies. It's like I shouldn't call everyone older than me a boomer, but they're acting like boomers. They're living in a world where you and I can't go on Twitter or YouTube or Google or whatever, and in 15 seconds have video evidence that disputes everything coming out of their mouths. A phrase, Tom, that I use on this show every now and then is one of my favorite ones, is they don't even respect you enough to lie well.
Yeah.
Do you feel like when you see these people make these admissions, wild claims to the contrary of video evidence, how much of that do you think is them just being completely ignorant that we live in current day where anyone with an iPhone in 5 seconds can look these things up? Or do you think is they have just such a complete just disdain for the public at large that they don't care?
Well, it's funny. I have a friend who attaches a lot more intelligence and even more sinister motives to these kinds of people than I do. And he's convinced that they actually do this on purpose. They want the critical thinking people out there, the people who see through them, to actually get the message that here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say something completely ridiculous, and at least enough people are going to believe it that I'm going to get away with it. And there's nothing you can do about it, Alan Mosley or Tom Mullen or anybody else who thinks like you. Now, I mean, that is pretty cynical and sinister. But my problem with that kind of thinking is that over the course of my career, I've managed to Forrest Gump my way into all kinds of situations that no one would believe some guy from Buffalo on the internet would be in. And whenever I've gotten into the secret room, rather than, oh my God, it's worse than I thought, it's more like, really? That was it? That's all you were thinking when you did this? It's usually something, you usually find that these people are not deep thinkers. You usually find that they're not capable of the kinds of devious master plans, but it's just the evidence keeps piling up that there can be no excuse for any of this. By the way, I wanted to mention too, Burks also admits that when she recommended the lockdown, she had no evidence it would work. But since she pitched 15 days to flatten the curve, that she said to herself, well, at least I have 15 days to get the evidence. And of course, at least the reporter on that story doesn't say, and did you ever get the evidence? Of course, it's not there.
Well, you brought up the historical angle. You talked about the New Deal, talked about Vietnam, but the interesting kind of point there being that sometimes we look at things, years, decades in the past, and we say, oh, well, we know today that narrative X, Y, and Z were incorrect. But oftentimes, as you pointed out, the cabinet, in the same, within years of the New Deal policies being instituted, they already knew that was a failure. And so it's similar, I think, to COVID, is that there were people on day one saying, well, this is not how public health is supposed to function. And then there were certainly people 3 months later, 6 months later, at the end of that summer of 2020 saying, oh, look, these policies don't work. The writing is already on the wall that this was a terrible disaster. And yet, as you pointed out, let's fast forward a couple of years. There's what we know and there's what we know. And what we know is this whole thing has been bungled from minute one. But the historical record, I have a hunch, Tom. This, you want to talk about being cynical. Here's my cynicism coming out. I have a hunch that while people like you and me from the very beginning may have realized, look, this is not going anywhere good, I bet the popular history texts 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now will say that absolutely every policy enacted was for the public good, that things would have been way worse. It's that same line of the vaccines, right? The vaccines don't work, but boy, when I get COVID anyway, it's a sure good thing I was vaccinated. That's like that token line from every celebrity or politician with their 4 jabs who ends up getting sick anyway. It's always, well, yeah, I got sick, but it would have been worse. I have a hunch that that's what the official historical record is going to be, no matter what you and I think we know.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons, I think. Number one, they have academia. They have had academia for over 100 years. So academia, the historians work in academia, and they write the history, and they never fail to write the history that the private sector and voluntary cooperation was a disaster until the government came in and saved everything with some ridiculous policy. And that's what makes me somewhat cynical about the way this will be remembered. Now, there's a large percentage of the public who can see right through all of this. And, you don't need that John Hopkins study to tell you lockdowns didn't do any good. You can just look around and see the many states that at least abandoned this at the beginning of 2021, if not earlier, that are not disasters. And people will say, well, they had 10% more of this and that. No, 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 no. The degree to which there is no pile of bodies in any of these states or these countries that didn't lock down, that overcomes confounding variables. You don't need an RCT study to show what is readily apparent. So, I think there's millions of people who see that. Let's just say half the country here in the United States sees that. You don't need 75% to agree with you. If you've got enough of the other side to go along, maybe not even a majority, you have enough to write the history the way you want. I mean, that's kind of my view of this kind of thing, because I know when I'm 90 years old, if I make it that far, I'll still be trying to tell people none of that did anything. All it did was destroy the country. We were still suffering the economic damage from those lockdowns decades later. And they'll be reading their school history book that says, no, 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 Dr. Fauci saved the country. And I'm not exactly sure what to do about it.
Well, it's a tough question. I know you and I are both kind of history wonks. My degrees are in history, and it's tough because I think if you were to grab the average person on the street today and say, "Hey, let's talk a little bit about fake news, the phenomenon of fake news." Now, the first problem might be that they think fake news is a recent phenomenon, whereas I would say, "Oh, no, 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 no. Fake news has been with us for that has infected journalism for hundreds of years." However, it's almost a foreboding thing to just kind of come to terms with, that if the news is fake, if what CNN or Fox or anyone else is spouting to us right now is at a minimum coded in propaganda, at a maximum is just objectively false, what about all those history books I read? What about all those things that we know what happened decades or even centuries before? How much of that didn't exactly happen the way we thought it did?
Yeah, well, go to the first incident in American history, Jamestown. What were we told about the Jamestown colony? Like they were all starving because, I don't know, mosquitoes or something, and they were suddenly incompetent when they got to the New World. Same with the so-called Pilgrims in Plymouth. And when you actually go back to read the accounts closer, well, you could read Bradford's account of the Plymouth colony, and you can read Captain John Smith's account of the Jamestown colony, and they both say, well, the problem was we had this communist system, and as soon as we got rid of it, we didn't have a problem anymore. Well, that's the primary source says that. Now, how did I go through like 40 years of my life and get not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree, and never heard anything about that? What I heard in Plymouth was, well, they didn't know how to grow corn in the New World until Squanto, the Indian, taught him this trick about putting a dead fish under each stalk. And then after that, everything was fine. And, it's funny, but that's what they teach. I mean, go and look at the history book your kids are reading today. They're not going to find anything about what William Bradford said was the problem and how it was solved. Same with John Smith. We've got Disney movies about Pocahontas. Nobody has a clue about this. It's hard to believe that that's not intentional.
I agree completely, and there's something that you already touched on that I want to talk a little bit about, because you know me, I'm always a salt the earth kind of person. Let's talk a little bit about consequences. Now, a question we had on the show actually just a few weeks ago, but I want to revisit it with you because I think it's very appropriate for this topic, is the bad actors suffering consequences for their actions. And the question that we dealt with a few weeks ago on the show, Tom, was can a people, can you or I, can society as a whole ever really move on from a debacle if the bad actors don't suffer consequences for their actions. So I guess I'll ask you a two-parter. Is first the answer to that question. Can society move on without the bad actors suffering negative consequences for their actions? And two, do you think that the worst of the worst, the lockdown governors, the Department of the FDA people, Department of Health people, the Birxes, the Faucis of the world, will those people ever suffer negative consequences? And however you choose to define the term, if that means jail time, great. If it just means political or career consequences, whatever, however you choose to define the term, can society move on without it? And will those people ever suffer consequences?
Well, I'm not hopeful that they will. And the fair consequences. I'm not a death penalty person. I wouldn't even want to give Fauci or or Klaus Schwab, for that matter, the death penalty. But they should be tried for fraud. At least Fauci should be tried for fraud. He knowingly lied under oath. That's a crime. I mean, it is to me like, well, you know, lying to Congress is kind of like speaking French in France, but it is against the law. And more importantly, he defrauded the public, and he encouraged the president to try to mandate a vaccine that we can now see the trials were not honest. They were riddled with, it seems like intentionally misleading information. Birx knew that there was no proof these lockdowns were going to do anything, yet she recommended that the president really end the careers of a lot of people. We haven't even recovered all the jobs that we lost just in March and April of 2020. They keep saying, oh, we got 300,000 new jobs. Well, if you add up the jobs we lost and then all the ones we supposedly gained since then, at the last month, we were still 200,000 short. And when we get to even, it's not like we're going to be even. There's something like 5 million jobs that should have been created on top of that 20 million. So, this has caused generational damage. And I think that if these people were convicted of fraud and just given some jail sentences and restitution, that would wake the public up that yes, these people, the government is capable of committing crimes against the public, which you and I know they do every day. That just doesn't enter the mind of at least half the country. All the people with these circles around their profile pics, we can do this, all this nonsense. I mean, these people, it never enters their mind that the government could be criminal. And that's what needs to happen, is that awakening.
Well, it's so interesting when you wade into the political side of things, because I know a lot of people expect that the midterms and probably the next presidential election as well is going to be a red wave. There's going to be a lot of Republicans are going to be taking office in the next couple of years, and that's all well and good to say, well, this is a political comeuppance for Democrats for lockdowns and masking and madness. But the fact of the matter is that I'm with you that I don't expect there to ever truly be consequences for these people, because the career Republican politicians are just as much a part of the swamp as they are. I don't see any great trials taking place. There's not going to be a January 6th commission-esque run by right-wingers in which they put on all the left-wing COVID people on trial. It's not going to happen, because they would have to put a lot of themselves on trial as well, wouldn't they? Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, nobody's innocent on the lockdowns, not even DeSantis. He locked down from March until I think the end of September of 2020. All right. To his credit, he listened to, and I think he actually read the scientific data and said, okay, I'm not convinced that this is doing anything. I'm going to change my mind. That's great. But he did do it. And then most of the Republican governors, to some extent, went along with the lockdowns for much longer than he did. And here's the thing. Here's the problem with politics, is that let's say they have this big landslide, which I'm not at all convinced that they're going to have. I think we've been talking about this landslide too long. It's like people in the stock market say when everything one thinks something's going to go one way, it's going to go the other. But let's just say that it does go that way and the Republicans get in. Number one, we know that they never get in there and abolish any bad laws. And they really don't have a lot of incentive to go after those people because now they've got power. And what they want to do is keep power. They want to keep as many people on the fence from, thinking that they were too harsh. They don't want to give the other side this cause, this reason to get motivated to go out and get them out 2 years later. So it's always better to keep the status quo. And the only thing I'm wondering, and this is the question, will they go in there and keep the January 6th commission going? Why aren't they calling that guy in who took down all the fences? They've caught him on video out there taking the barricades down before any rioters got to the perimeter of the Capitol. Of course, Ray Epps, why aren't they going to call him up and let's see him testify on camera under oath that he was never in contact with any government agency, state or federal, on January 5th or 6th before the conversation with the FBI that he admits to. I mean, these are easy things that anybody, would bring up. Any reporter would ask if anyone was being honest here. I don't think the Republicans are even going to do that. I'd like to believe differently.
Well, you know me, I love crapping all over Republicans. There's a certain irony. We had a clip from last week that I will admit was really just red meat for right wingers, and it got a lot of views. And I mean, I'm not displeased with having made the clip, but I'm always mindful of the fact of, well, this, all the right wingers are really loving this clip. So, next week we're going to crap all over Republicans because we have to maintain balance here on the program. A lot of people pointed out, Steve Bannon, he was found guilty. He's probably going to get 30 days or whatever he's going to get. Well, Obama's Holder, who involved with all the Fast and Furious stuff and the gun running, he appeared before Congress on those very topics, lied to their faces, and was proven to be a liar. Was he prosecuted? No. Why wasn't he? Because Republicans just never seem to have the stones to really go after their opponents the way that their opponents are willing to go after them. Would you say that that's an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more of the Jacobin in the Democrats and on the left. I mean, these are the people who operated the guillotine, and yeah, I think that there just isn't that spirit on the Republican side, and to some, in normal times, that's probably good, right? You don't want the political system being used to go out there and chop people's heads off, figuratively or literally. But at some point, they have to do something other than hold the line, because they're always holding a line that's 50 yards back. And, the other thing is, what are their principles? I mean, they don't really believe in the things that we believe in. They believe in that stability is an end in and of itself. And, what do they fight about when even when they're campaigning, on spending, it's spending on Big Bird. Yeah, I'm going to cut 3 cents off the $4 trillion budget. And that's the hill I'm going to die on. Or, I mean, any high profile cause that a Republican takes is one that isn't going to make a significant difference to the average American. And we all know what those differences would be. And of course, neither side wants to look at that, like cutting the military in half, like repealing the whole New Deal, all of it. Get rid of all of those executive agencies that are in, defiance of the Constitution, legislating every day. Social Security and Medicare, they've got to go. That's unpopular, but they either have to go or that's all you're going to pay for. So, and sooner or later, you won't be able to pay for that. So, these are the kinds of things somebody has to tell Americans. It's never a good day to do it, but I think we're really getting close to that. It was always decades in the future. I think we're months in the future at this point.
Yeah, I know it's funny. You talk about something like Social Security. The next wiggling out of the narrative is going to be, you're going to have left wingers 20 years from now saying, well, we never thought Social Security was supposed to be a full retirement. We always thought it was just supposed to be supplemental. So that's just, stay tuned for that. This is the prediction that I'll make here. I do predict that the Republicans will take the House and the Senate, and I do predict that we will have a Republican president next. However, I also predict that a lot of them will run on the platform of and even perhaps say or do something in Congress to the extent of lockdowns and mandates associated with COVID were wrong. Now, that's not an incorrect statement. But I think the difference between the statement you and I would make and what the statement that milquetoast Republicans would make is they're saying lockdowns and mandates associated with COVID were wrong. You and I would say lockdowns and mandates are wrong. We don't have to put, because of COVID. We don't have to put because of anything. And sure enough, this is where Republicans fail. You're already hearing the whispers of, monkeypox, that's going to be the next boogeyman. And the Biden administration is already mulling over, well, let's stockpile monkeypox vaccines. Let's consider calling a national emergency over monkeypox. So again, it's not really about monkeypox, is it? It's about having established the precedent that you can just declare an emergency at any time on any whim with no hard data whatsoever to prove it being necessary, and then roll out all the pork you can imagine. I don't see Republicans really being willing to turn off the spigot.
No, and another thing that would be an easy thing to do, whether it would succeed or not, is propose an amendment that the federal government has no right to mandate a vaccine or other medical treatment. Easy. Propose the amendment and see if the required number of states will ratify it. That there's no that's an easy thing to do. Will they do it? I don't know. I'm not sure that would fail, because you're not talking about majority of individuals. You're talking about, 36 states. And I'm not sure that you couldn't get 36 states to go along with that, but we should find out. I've always said we should have a lot more amendments to the Constitution. Let's find out what the governed are willing to consent to or not. That's the only way for them to consent to a new power. And you could even propose them for past things like Social Security. And that doesn't mean that if the amendment were ratified, it would make it right. But at least we'd have, some semblance that people agreed to this, however, imperfect the agreement was. Whereas right now, I just don't see anything like that happening. And it just popped into my mind, but wouldn't that be an easy win? Propose an amendment.
Well, that'll have to be a conversation, I think, for us for another day, is which group is worse? Are liberals worse because they know that they can't pass constitutional amendments, so they just end around it by executive decree or in bureaucracy? Or are conservatives worse because they could propose amendments and don't?
Yeah, I mean, they probably wouldn't want to propose a lot of amendments for the things because basically the left got everything they wanted in the 20th century. But it would be a good exercise to do that and just see how many things that, let's say, the Supreme Court added to the federal list of powers that would not be able to pass in an amendment. And I mean, this is another thing that if people really believed in the Constitution, and I mean the general public, that, the federal government should not exercise any power not given to it, they would not sit still for this group of high priests in black robes to sit there and listen to hours of testimony and then have to write an 80-page paper telling them that, yes, indeed, this power really is in this 5-page document. We found it in there. If it isn't obviously in the document, then at least in the spirit of the Constitution, you propose an amendment. And if indeed, this is something the federal government already has, well, it should fly right through. Everybody should ratify it in a minute. So it's really dishonest to even go through, to me, the exercise of judicial review, because you're already saying that, on a first read, I can't find this power there. And now I need 9 lawyers politically appointed to try and come up with some tortured reasoning why it really is in there somewhere. So, really, it's I don't think it's unreasonable to say that nobody really believes in the idea of the Constitution anymore. Not obviously not the politicians, but not even the public either.
Well, on that note, I know we're running short on time, but I feel like we would be remiss to not mention Ukraine for a moment. And I know you had that in your notes as well. Because the Ukraine narrative, kind of very similar to monkeypox, COVID, whatever. Of course, COVID is like the never ending story, right? You know, that's still with us 2.5 years later. I don't think Ukraine's going to make it that long. I don't think that it just, the narrative simply won't survive that long because the war won't go that long. And you're already seeing that narrative start to fall apart. I saw an article, Tom, that was in I think it was in MSNBC or CNBC, but a major left-leaning news outlet that the headline was basically purporting that, well, we always knew that Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. You know, maybe we should have been second guessing all this money. Now, I was genuinely surprised to see that headline, both from the outlet it came from and the fact that, wow, is the narrative already shifting on Ukraine so soon? What do you think?
Well, there was another one in foreign policy where they pointed out that Ukraine is literally keeping their civilian men prisoner in their districts, not allowing them to travel, not allowing them to leave the district, much less the country, in case they need to press them into service later. So, and they, the article was not flattering about this. So this is foreign policy, the Council on Foreign Relations mouthpiece of the empire, for all those who don't already know. So yeah, you're starting to see them put out the idea. Let's start backing away from this. Now, in terms of how much longer this is going to go on, I saw a clip from Gonzalo Lira. I never get his name right the first time. And he's, of course, considered Russian propaganda or whatever, just a guy that lives in Ukraine that hasn't towed the imperial line. But he says that the fighting is about to end in the Donbass region, but that there's really nothing there after. If when the Russians break out of the Donbass, there's just nothing to stop them to the Polish border. Now, he's either right or wrong about that. If he's right and the war is over in, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks, what are they going to say then? I mean, they're still telling us now that they're about to depose Putin, that he's in trouble in Russia and that Russia's running out of steam. That's another headline from the other day, while they're also starting to plant these negative things about Ukraine. So, it's another one. Let's just say that Russia wins this thing in the next month and is able to impose a very harsh treaty on Ukraine to end all this and cuts them off from the Black Sea, takes Odessa, etc. What's the empire going to say, and what's the public going to do when they've been told and been fleeced of $60+ billion sent to Ukraine, just like Vietnam, under the pretense that it's all going very well? Are they even going to object to this or just go along with it? That's going to be interesting to see.
Well, it's a toughie because, it's almost like in modern politics and modern medias, we're things have always been this way, but we're in a true accelerationist time that instead of a narrative being built for months or years or even decades, a narrative just pops up out of thin air and is parroted by all the bots and media establishment, and it may only last 60 days, 90 days, and boom, they're on to the next thing, if even that. And so I think a lot of people rightfully wonder, well, wait a minute. If they announce that they're sending another $1 billion to Ukraine on a Tuesday, and then that Thursday the war is declared over and they're at the negotiating table, does that mean they're sending that $1 billion back? Where did that $1 billion go? I mean, we all can remember back to Iraq, right? And in the post 9/11 world, we can remember back to the audits at the Pentagon and the trillions of dollars missing and the billions of dollars that went to Iraq for various programs that then, in 15 seconds of auditing, you can say, here's the money, here's the next ledger, the money's gone. And there's just no trail. It's just simply disappeared. I think a lot of people, Tom, look at Ukraine that way, and I'm happy that a lot of people are waking up to that. But I feel like, and I hate to end this on a cynical note, but while I feel like more of the public at large might see that perspective, the problem is that when all of those orders and bills were being put forth to send billions of dollars to aid to places like Ukraine, the Democrat and Republican establishment couldn't sign off on it fast enough, which means that you have a larger percentage of the public who says, "Oh man, that was a grift," but they don't really have anyone to vote for. Who? What side of the political aisle are you supporting? They both were perfectly content to do it.
I don't know if this is philosophical or what you'd call it, but I wonder, and this occurred to me just before we came on, does specialization lead to this kind of thing? In other words, specialization, the division of labor, and extreme specialization, which is what our modern economy has, with people that are so focused on one very narrow occupation. Now, this produces tremendous wealth, of course, and all of the miracles that the private sector produces. But I wonder if it just also leads people to just not know anything else besides what they specialize in. And just picture that. I think Joe Biden's approval ratings are in the 30s, and some of those people might not even know why they approve of him. And let me suggest that you could have very low public approval of something, but you have a public that thinks that there is a majority approval. In other words, like you said, I have the bots, I have all the media saying what I want them to say, and the average person who does their very specialized job is just saying, well, it sounds like that's what everyone thinks, when in fact all the people around them actually object as he does or she does. I don't know. It's just a speculation that ran through my mind that we could have this society full of people who don't agree with any of this, and maybe just don't realize how much support they have.
Tom, where can people go to support you and get more Tom Mullen goodness?
TomMullenTalksFreedom.com. That's the place to go. The podcast is there. My writing is there. And if you care to sign up for Patreon or Substack, you can do that on the support page.
Tom, we're going to get you out of here on this one. Are you ready?
All right.
Is a waffle a cake?
Wow. I'm not ready for that one. I got the last one right, so I don't want to go out with a tie. Is a waffle a cake? It's got batter. It's made on a griddle. It's not baked. I'll say no. It's not baked. No.
Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. Unfortunately, a waffle is a cake. We have to shame our friends and neighbors who eat cake for breakfast, and that is including waffles. But Tom, you did pretty good otherwise. Thanks for being here with us, buddy. I appreciate it.
Always my pleasure, Alan. Thanks.